coming to what I'm sure will be a fantastic session. My name is Katharina Hundfeld, and I'm an editorial board member of the journal. This event is hosted by the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Struggles Network at Historical Materialism. We run these events fairly regularly now, so if you haven't already, please do sign up for our mailing list to hear more about our future events. And we posted the link in the YouTube chat. Today we're here with two brilliant comrades who will present their books for us. Alex Stoffel is a lecturer in international politics at Queen Mary University London. He's also a member of the editorial collective of the journal Historical Materialism. And his research takes up critical questions regarding the intersections of sexuality, race, and desire within capitalist expansion. His first book, EROS and Empire, The Transnational Struggle for Sexual Freedom in the United States, is out with Stanford University Press. Alex, can you give us the briefest TLDR of your book, please?
So EROS and Empire is a book about queer political history. So it reconsiders the history of US-based struggles for sexual freedom, focusing especially on the internationalism of those movements. And then it derives from that transnational history, new perspectives on debates around sexuality and desire and resistance and capitalism.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jules Gleeson is a writer, comedian, and historian. She's the co-editor of Transgender Marxism, published with Pluto Press in 2021. Her new book, for which we're here today, is called Hermaphrodite Logic, A History of Intersex Liberation, coming out with Verso in June. Jules, can you give us the briefest overview of your book, please?
Sure thing. Hermaphrodite Logic is a new history of the intersex movement, and especially I'm looking at why the intersex movement started in the 1990s and what it has done to reshape the face of sex and political struggle up to the present day.
Brilliant, let's get started. I will let both authors talk about their books for about 25 minutes, after which we will have time for a discussion between the authors. Great, Alex, on to you now.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Kat. It's really, really great to be here with both of you. Okay, let me get up my slides. Cool. So we're currently witnessing a global backlash against LGBT people, and that backlash has successfully united a quite motley array of social forces around its opposition to gender, which has become this amorphous term that represents for this movement an ideological construct that threatens the supposedly undeniable naturalness of binary sex and heterosexual desire. And the rejection of this so-called biological truth is said to be heralding widespread social and moral decay, and it's said to be finding its expression in the assault on the sanctity of marriage and the family, the erosion of religious authority, the weakening of national borders, the corruption of children, and the unleashing of sexual perversities throughout civil society, to name but a few examples. Within the Anglophone world, children have emerged as the flashpoint of anti-gender politics. So here we have seen bans on gender-affirming care for transgender children. We've seen restrictions on LGBTI inclusive curricula in schools, and we've seen a resurgence of conspiracy theories and moral panics about grooming and pedophilia. This anti-gender movement has been on the rise for at least a decade now, and it followed a period of unprecedented legal and representational victories for LGBTI people. Mainstream LGBT campaigns had been remarkably successful at securing civil rights, like same-sex marriage and adoption rights and inclusion within the military. In the media, many celebrities were coming out as gay, lesbian, and trans, and there was a surge in LGBT representation in TV and film. And of course, corporations were actively embracing LGBT consumers. As early as the 1990s, which is when this started, a new image of a sort of high-earning, propertied, white gay consumer demographic with disposable income and no children had begun to circulate, and members of the gay community Members of the gay community in sort of the 90s were being granted access to consumer credit, and so they were also becoming concerned with obtaining methods to secure their new wealth. So they began to demand the recognition of their relationships as legitimate units of reproduction and of inheritance, which explains the centrality of campaigns in favor of same-sex marriage and adoption rights within the LGBT politics of those decades. So basically, in the pursuit to secure legal avenues for the transmission of private property, the LGBT movement demanded and won inclusion within the entitlements afforded by state recognition. So those were mainly rights concerning marriage and child rearing. A vibrant transfeminist movement has emerged as a supersession of both these poles of LGBT politics. So it, of course, rejects the anti-gender movement's pathologization of queer and trans life, but it has also articulated radical and utopian political horizons that far exceed the mainstream LGBT movement's focus on recognition and inclusion. So transfeminism has in recent years offered us a vision of human flourishing that addresses our most embodied needs for bodily self-determination and health and connection and love. And it is a vision that has demanded a program of wide-ranging social transformation. That recent history of LGBTI, both inclusion and persecution, as well as the transfeminist forces that seek to overcome that dialectic, is one instance of what is a more fundamental capitalist dialectic that the historian John D'Amelio outlined in an essay in 1983. And I want to take that essay as a starting point to think about what a historical materialist approach to the study of sexual politics might look like. So what does that capitalist dialectic look like for D'Amelio? With the rise of the capitalist system of free wage labor, newly formed individual subjects were able to reproduce themselves through the impersonal relations of the market by selling their labor power in exchange for a wage. So viewers will be familiar with this story. Property ownership under capitalism was mediated now by impersonal market forces. And as families were dispossessed of the means of production and individual family members were forced to reproduce themselves outside of their family unit as wage laborers, sexuality was accordingly decoupled from the imperative of procreation. That's the story that D'Amelio charts. So with that, new sexual relations, in particular male homosexuality and urban prostitution, were the product of that historical transition to capitalist social relations. Of course, in these new capitalist societies, not all proletarians became wage workers. It was men who were most able to reproduce themselves through wage labor outside of the family unit and socialize with communities of men within the public sphere. And so the visibility of male homosexual cultures stemmed from that greater presence of men in the public sphere, while many women and children continued to depend directly on the personal relations of the family unit for their survival. Those women who didn't become dependent on a man in marriage had more limited opportunities to reproduce themselves through the wage relation. And the rapidly growing sex economy within newly industrialized cities was a sort of notable exception. So this is how we can think of how homosexuality and prostitution emerge in this transition to capitalism. But that transition to capitalism also led to the persecution of those non-normative sexual cultures, since they were deemed threats to the reproductive units of bourgeois civil society. That is, to marriage, to monogamous coupledom, to the normative family, to private property, to legitimate procreation, and so on. So these new cultures of gender and sexual deviance were repressed through various modes of punishment and dehumanization and criminalization and pathologization. That's the capitalist dialectic between, on the one hand, the creation of conditions of possibility for the emergence of new non-normative sexual cultures, and on the other hand, the state-led persecution of those subcultures, which was required to secure the illusory universality of a new bourgeois private sphere. And that capitalist dialectic has to be at the heart of any attempt to understand sexual politics within capitalist societies. And it has to be at the heart of any attempt to understand the more mutinous, insurrectionary, or even sometimes anti-capitalist queer formations that sought to supersede that dialectic of recognition and persecution, inclusion and exclusion. So we see this dialectic play out in the post-war period. Economic depression and the Second World War had flattened social hierarchies, had facilitated the establishment of homosexual enclaves in cities. It had disinhibited many sexual mores and had also disrupted nuclear family life in many Western states. But post-war developments had also simultaneously sort of enabled the creation of new visible subcultures of sexual gender deviance and introduced punitive measures in response to curb those new cultures. So on the one hand, the decades after the war witnessed a reconsolidation of the traditional sexual and gender regime through the restoration of a male-led private nuclear family, through extreme pronatalism, and also through suburbanization. But on the other hand, many unmarried women were impelled to re-enter the workforce after demobilization. Emergent underground urban cultures fostered new social identities and expressions, and moral panics about sexual deviancy and pathology erupted, things like the Lavender Scare. So in that post-war period, you have the reconsolidation of the bourgeois family unit, which was necessary for the rationalization of the post-war production process. And with that, the state also instituted new forms of repression and persecution to enforce that reconsolidation of the nuclear family. The gay liberation movement of the post-war period emerges as a struggle against those conditions of organized state repression. So John D'Amelio explains this in his 1983 essay. He writes, and I'm quoting here, by the time of the Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969, the event that ignited the gay liberation movement, our situation was hardly one of silence, invisibility, and isolation. A massive grassroots liberation movement could form almost overnight precisely because communities of lesbians and gay men existed. Although gay community was a precondition for a mass movement, the oppression of lesbian and gay men was the force that propelled the movement into existence. As the subculture expanded and grew more visible in the post-World War II era, oppression by the state intensified, becoming more systematic and inclusive. Gay liberation was a response to this contradiction. And we see this dialectic then play out again in the following decades. So the deindustrialization of cities like New York in the 1970s left thousands of warehouses and lots and manufacturing spaces abandoned across many neighborhoods. And many of those spaces were repurposed by working class queer people. So places like in New York City, for instance, Times Square or the Christopher Street Piers, which is where young queer and trans people of color would conduct voguing competitions and ballroom shows. These became new sites of visible and publicly accessible queer social life, and the local infrastructure in those areas, which were often established through commercialized venues for public sex, were facilitating the emergence of these sort of queer forms of collectivity throughout the 70s and the early 80s. The neoliberal restructuring of those cities, however, meant drastic cuts to social spending, gentrification, and a rebranding of cities like New York and London as cosmopolitan cultural centers. And real estate development in those decades completely transformed the urban landscape. So the redevelopment of those industrial manufacturing and warehousing spaces displaced working class communities. And so over the 80s and 90s, real estate speculation ended up eviscerating those queer communities. Most of these spaces were closed down through gentrification as they were transformed into the family-friendly tourist havens and retail complexes and entertainment complexes that we know today. So upscale development projects and reductions in social service provision in the 80s hurled racialized and queer working class people to the margins of society, which is where they were then immediately struck by the AIDS epidemic and the crack epidemic. And of course, the AIDS activist movement emerged in this context, not just as a fight for access to drugs and to healthcare, but as one node in a larger network of anti-neoliberal resistance movements. So the AIDS activist movement created links between gentrification, real estate development, neoliberal privatization, and public health. So what I've been attempting to draw out in this very schematic brief history is a historical materialist approach to studying sexual politics. The idea here is that capitalism has both produced the historical conditions for the rise of non-normative gender and sexual formations, and it has called upon the punitive powers of the state to repress and police those formations. And radical struggles for sexual freedom we have to understand them as taking shape in relation to that dialectic. So my book, EROS and Empire, focuses on four movements in particular: the gay liberationists of the late 60s and early 70s, the Black lesbian feminists of the late 70s and early 80s, and then the AIDS activists of the late 80s and early 90s, and with some reflections on the contemporary trans feminist movement towards the end of the book. And the book makes the simple argument that there is a queer radical tradition, one that I term erotic world making. And the book charts its intellectual frameworks and political ideologies and organizational infrastructure. So it's a book about generations of radicals who embraced the proposal that our existing configurations of gender and sexuality were not the natural order of things, but rather were an expression of capitalist social relations, and therefore up to us to make anew, so that the most private concerns of our lives could actually become a vantage point from which to collectively reconsider and remake society as a whole. So Eros and Empire then is a book about the historical tendencies that were built by these movements. So I want to say something about how politics, resistance, freedom is thought of traditionally within queer studies, and then how my book diverges from those accounts. So to think about politics and to think about resistance for queer studies is really to think about desire. So in many ways, the field of queer studies took up the question that has been plaguing critical theorists for over a century, which is how are our desires organized and harnessed and directed or even manipulated for the reproduction of the given social order. The most standard accounts of desire define it as a relation to objects upon which we project our needs and hopes and fantasies. And healthy and normal desires are said to be those that create attachments to objects that promise an entry into whiteness and heteronormativity and national belonging and productivity and other normative categories of bourgeois society. So we desire the comforts that are afforded by consumerism and by nuclear family life and by marriage and so on. The streamlining of desires towards so-called appropriate objects reinforces social integration and maintains social order, and desires that don't follow that script are accordingly stigmatized and pathologized and sometimes labeled queer. Queer scholars have been carefully attuned to the more uncontainable, unreliable, and mysterious side of desire. So it turns out, they find, that our desires are actually pretty difficult to manage. Desire constantly fails to reproduce those stable attachments to proper objects. And so it threatens to disorganize and destabilize and disturb the existing order. So no matter how much we're told that we will be rewarded for desiring the right things, our desires just can't be captured or disciplined in a straightforward way. So queer thought doesn't shy away from that more anarchical side of desire. On the contrary, it actually welcomes the disruption that it brings. And that's really at the heart of a lot of famous queer concepts. So for Judith Butler, for instance, it's precisely the failure to constantly repeat an attachment to a normative ideal like gender that opens up possibilities of transformation. Or for the anti-social theorists like Lee Edelman and Leo Bersani and Tim Dean, desire's drive towards destruction is what promises an undoing of normative identity categories, indeed of the self. That's how many canonical queer scholars think about the political character of queerness. Um, the political character of queerness is sort of thought of as like um, the way. So basically, the idea is that queer people, through failing to refuse, by failing or refusing to reenact the norms that stabilize a given heteropatriarchal order, open up possibilities for the creation of new social relations. And the term queer world making is used by many queer scholars to describe that politicization of queerness. So when queer theorists borrowed the term world making in the late 90s, they did so in part to shed light on the practices that are too often omitted in discussions of formal political models. So Jose Munoz uses the term queer world making to describe the creative ways that queer people have contested the dominant logics of the public sphere through theatrical enactments of selfhood that defy the prescriptions of heteronormativity and whiteness. These are public performances that envision new social relations that become the foundation of a counter-public sphere. So for Munoz, it's through iterative public performances of queerness that oppositional worlds are formed. Queer world making is also described as linked to the formation of counterpublics in Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner's famous essay, Sex in Public. So they describe queer counterpublics as sustained by practical knowledges that are developed in sites of drag and youth culture, music, dance, parades, cruising sites, and so on. And the transience of those queer counterpublics makes it difficult to recognize them as social movements. So for both Munoz and for Berlant and Warner, queer world making refers to a set of oppositional social practices that subvert the heteronormative logics of the dominant public sphere and enact alternative counterpublics. There are three things about that conception of queer politics that stand out and that I want to draw attention to. So first, accounts of queer world making present an overly restricted and sometimes dematerialized view of queer worlds. So for Munoz, queer world making establishes, quote, oppositional ideologies that function as critiques of oppressive regimes of truth that subjugate minoritarian people, end quote. So the performances that it includes, from poetry to art to cruising, these are all rendered intelligible almost exclusively as forms of critical knowledge production. And for Berlant and Warner, like for Munoz, queer world making builds practical knowledges. They're quite explicit about this. Second, these accounts tend to conflate the fight to secure conditions of survival with the political horizon of queer world making itself. So Munoz does, to his credit, acknowledge that not all performances are liberatory or transformative. However, his readers are left wondering how to determine which performative interventions are likely to be more politically efficacious than others, and how those performances should be coordinated or planned. So in his book, Cruising Utopia, he formulates queer world making as a prefigurative practice that finds what he calls anticipatory illuminations of the utopian within decentralized quotidian moments of performative disruption. But significantly, the treatment of cultural and aesthetic performances as representational practices interpolates the subject as a spectator rather than as a political actor, and grants primacy to the denaturalization of governing regimes of truth, as he calls it, over things like planning and organizing. So he writes, quote, such performances transport the performer and the spectator to a vantage point where transformation and politics are imaginable. And of course, while expanding the limits of political imagination is integral to any political struggle, that performative process becomes disconnected from the task of realizing itself when it's left to individual spectators, for whom it can signify in different and unexpected ways. And then third, there's the question of scale. So within a lot of queer and feminist scholarship since the 90s, there's been a mandate to scale down to local meanings and practices of gender and sexuality. So the dominant mode of academic writing has placed a premium on micro-level narrative and biographically centered studies of the meaningfulness of subjective or interiorized experience. And that tendency is also evident in our accounts of queer counterpublics, where these counterpublics are envisioned as highly confined subterranean and fugitive sites, places like bathhouses and ballrooms and dance venues and other localized semi-public contexts. Okay, so the idea here, the sort of takeaway from that section, is that canonical queer studies, with its overwhelming focus on things like discourse and language and representation and performance and epistemic production and the realm of the symbolic, it tends to conceptualize political resistance almost as an incidental or spontaneous feature of queerness. So queer people necessarily fail to perform or to iteratively enact normative ideals of gender and sexuality, and that's how they open up new possibilities of gender and sexual expression. What my book argues is that if we look at radical queer history over the past half century, we find that the primary goal of queer politics was not, as much canonical scholarship would have us believe, a subcultural rejection of prevailing gender norms through performances of alternative expressions of identity, although that was certainly a part of queer politics. But the goal was rather a transformation of society as a whole, and that would include things like the nuclear family and private property and gender divisions of labor, in fact, alienated wage labor altogether. So these movements certainly did politicize non-normative identities and erotic desires, but they hoped to channel them into revolutionary forms of politics. Those politicized queer identities and erotic desires were treated as a stand-in for a total transformation of society, not simply as fleeting sites of freedom or expression that were confined within the heteronormative public sphere. And I use the phrase erotic world making to indicate both an indebtedness to, but also a departure from accounts of queer world making. And so now let me just very quickly sketch what that departure looks like. So first, erotic world making, the term, is meant to center the extensive transnational infrastructures that were built and sustained by queer movements. Because by conceiving queer world making as a form of critical knowledge production, queer scholars have actually deducted all of the institutions of queer politics from their accounts of queer world making. So the alternative history of queer politics that my book presents begs some questions like, can the AIDS activist movement appear in that account of queer world making? This was an activist, ACT UP, for example, was an activist group that spawned branches in almost 150 cities worldwide and experimented with various organizational forms and leadership structures. Can the Black lesbian feminist movement appear? A movement that was anchored in groups like the Third World Women's Alliance and the Combahee River Collective, many of whose members emerged from institutions like the Freedom and Freedom Ways journals and the Harlem Writers Guild. And gay liberationism, too, formed extensive institutional networks with groups like the Gay Liberation Front and Third World Gay Revolution, Red Butterfly, Radical Lesbians, and Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. These groups opened chapters in dozens of US cities and also countless more around the globe. But the centrality of those expansive transnational infrastructures has been mostly omitted from available accounts of queer world making. Then second, my account of erotic world making breaks from traditional queer accounts of politics that privilege the performative prefigurations of cultural and aesthetic practices at expense of the partisan questions of strategy, organization, capacity, and endurance. So the political productiveness of a performative disruption is determined by the space within which it occurs, the others that are involved in or implicated by the performance, and how they receive and interpret what they see. And the protagonists in my book were well aware of this. So activist groups like ACT UP were well known for their theatrical activist tactics, like die-ins and other disruptive public performances. But those actions weren't separate from the partisan business of addressing questions of planning and prioritization and organization that were the subject of heated and lengthy debates and weekly meetings that often drew in crowds of 500 to 600 activists. So queer radicals didn't simply celebrate subversions or disruptions of any and all kind, which norms to subvert, how to do so effectively, what would replace them. Those were the political questions that were to be determined consciously and collectively by these organizations. And then third and lastly, erotic world making aims to situate the history of radical sexual politics within the transnational social relations from which it emerges. So it shows that the activities of these movements far surpass the boundaries of an urban counterpublic. The concept of erotic world making is trying to capture the continuities of US-based struggles for sexual liberation over a 50, 60-year period and capture their transnational connections to numerous struggles that were developing across the globe. And those erotic world-making projects, which were forged under the conditions of US-led global capitalism and which were fundamentally shaped by their transnational entanglements, they conditioned not only the trajectory of US queer history, but they also radicalized wider anti-imperialist, socialist, and abolitionist struggles, both past and present. Okay, and I'll stop there.
Brilliant, Alex. Thank you so much. Jules, on to you now.
Delighted to be following on from that. Let me just go through the ceremonial screen sharing. 1-2 step. Is that up and running? Are you seeing what I'm seeing?
Yes, we're all good. Yeah.
Gorgeous. Okay, fantastic. Well then, I shall present. So this is a brief presentation providing a glimpse, a teaser of my book out 3rd of June, Hermaphrodite Logic. So today's talk, which is titled Back to the 90s, Back to Hermaphrodites, is going to look at 4 different angles on the book, which, as the front cover will tell you, is a history of the intersex movement. Those 4 lines of illumination are going to be Hermaphrodite Logic as a movement history, as an intellectual history, as an international history, and as an entangled history. But just to begin, I'm going to follow the form of the book itself and sort of drop you in media res. So the book's first chapter is The Boston Revelation, and it goes as follows. Unknown to those inside, demonstrators appeared outside the 1996 annual meeting of the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, in Boston, Massachusetts. The protests to ringleaders came dressed for dystopian sci-fi or for a hardcore show. Both had short hairs and glasses. One was dressed in a bomber jacket over denim, and the other in a dark green ankle-length trench coat, which I shall take you to see in a moment after equally ceremonial technical difficulties. Both had short hair and glasses. One was dressed in a black bomber jacket over denim, and the other in a dark green ankle-length trench coat. After some confusion about whether they would be given an opportunity to participate in the event itself, the demonstrators improvised by picketing the enormous Boston Convention Center's front approach. Flanked by members of Boston's local trans-feminist group, Transsexual Menace, and their allies from across Massachusetts, the group provided a spectacle quite unlike typical proceedings for a pediatrician's conference. They unfurled a banner that read Hermaphrodites with Attitude and picketed the event for the rest of the day. Many doctors brushed them off on the way through, but the sense of spectacle was unmistakable. The pair of protesters conversed with the minority of passing professionals who'd stopped to speak with them, sharing both their personal stories and statistics collected from interviewing other intersex people. They delivered talks to press cameras, fielded questions from intrigued reporters, and held aloft placards with slogans including "Silence equals death" and "Keep your scalpels off intersex kids." As they explained, both of the protest leaders had themselves sustained harms from the same wing of the medical profession that had gathered there to discuss their own clinical best practices. This made their appearance picketing at the event's threshold both strategically obvious and personally demanding. Who was this strange pair? And who were the intersexuals of North America who they claimed to speak for? Certainly, some of the clinicians who encountered them could be forgiven for being at a loss as to their origins, while for others, their presence would serve as an entirely unwelcome reminder of an ongoing professional struggle that was now entering a new era. So, as this chapter continues, I tell the story of Max Beck and Morgan Holmes, the two protesters I described and then eventually showed you an image of there. And the reason I dropped you in this way is that this book is purposely one that begins in media res. So we start off historically in 1996 at this moment of a bold new challenge to post-war sexological orthodoxy. So the feedback being offered by demonstrators who've been through the medical regimes, which we now love to critique. So the reason I begin here is that I think a lot of these historical accounts sort of actually start far too early in the day. Perhaps they reel it back as far as Karl Ulrichs. Perhaps they look at the Wissenschaft of sexuality in the interwar period in Germany, or more likely they sort of pick up with the post-war US establishment, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, John Money, and all these other familiar institutional names which roll off the tongue. So the purpose of Hermaphrodite Logic is actually to begin the real rather later and in a rather more focused way. And I do that for the purposes of really playing out the political struggle and agonism, which have allowed us to even have any serious number of people in the public sphere who use this term intersex to apply to themselves. And I want to really get at how it came to pass that any serious number of people were out and about calling themselves intersex. I labor this point because here at this protest, even most members of the group were not present and openly in attendance, only two of them. And secondly, because I have an interest in sort of foregrounding and spotlighting exactly why it was the 1990s, specifically why it is the end point of 20th century counterculture, about as late as you could possibly get in the 20th century for a movement to begin, 96, or 1990 in an underground form. And I want to really get at the reasons that this was the exact point that the movement sprung into being or birthed itself, whatever metaphor you care to use. And I think the stakes in this are especially sort of teasing out obvious continuities which exist within intersex activism itself. So intersex activism as it now exists in the mid-2020s, but further to sort of tease out and keep in view obvious challenges to sex as a process, which are, as I'm sure we're all aware, being fully capitalized upon by the global right, increasingly in office. So, so that's the sort of the historical movement dimensions. But one dimension of this, which I'd like to introduce to you all today, and that I hope you are able to fully get out of the book, and perhaps a bit later on in this discussion with Alex and Katharina, is that this book is equally an attempt at an intellectual history of the intersex movement. And specifically, the point that I'm trying to get to is quite a stylistic one. So I use this term 90s edgy to sort of address the distinctive characteristics that emerge in the movement's origins for whatever reason at the end of the 20th century. So in particular, I have an interest in the rather cold style, the rather not impassive, but actually rather numbed out and sort of sardonic approach which these advocates took to their unbearable and dehumanizing treatment, and especially the way that the routinized form of these harms sort of lent itself to an edgy rhetoric that was intent on, firstly, downplaying obvious emotional affects and resonances, and secondly, displaying full fluency in the clinical idioms and terminology, which had bound these intersex advocates and normalized the indignities and injuries that they had endured. So towards this end, this is the first issue of Hermaphrodites with Attitude, the accompanying in-house magazine that accompanied that slogan I showed you on various placards at the beginning of this presentation. So Hermaphrodites with Attitude, obviously a 90s hip hop reference. If you're not familiar, check them out. The purpose of this propaganda, and especially this thing I'm going to hone in on here, which I've taken to calling the mutilated Rudolph that appears in the December 96 issue of Hermaphrodites with Attitude. The purpose of this kind of propaganda was not only to sort of shock and attract sympathy or empathetic, piteous responses from readers, but secondly, if we zoom in a little bit closer, as I just said, a display of fluency and subversive appropriation of clinical terminology. So I'll just read this out for you. So it says, Figure 1, A left, note disfiguring hypertrophy of the nose, B above, post-surgical aspect, an excellent cosmetic result was achieved. So this sort of seizure of the abject, which we saw from a lot of intersex advocates of the early and mid-1990s, I think is sort of both a stylistic choice, both a response to trauma, but equally something quite informative about both the internal form of intersex variations and the violence done in attempts to hide them. But secondly, was of a kind with other gay and lesbian movement, struggle, and organizational forms. So especially I'm thinking of groups like Lesbian Avengers, Queer Nation, and as I've mentioned already, Transsexual Menace, of course, its own reference to Lavender Menace, and this kind of in-jokey, dark, sardonic, and flamboyant move through move within activism, which was in full flow by the 1990s. So that's the sort of like intellectual point which interests me about the movement's birth and how it exists at the outset. So we'll just move through this one. So the third point that I'm trying to get to is that Hermaphrodite Logic provides at the outset this kind of like focused precision snapshot view of intersex liberation. So honing on this particular moment in Boston. But necessarily the movement history sort of expands outwards as the historical account continues. So in 2 chapters, Hums is Human and A Struggle Without a Center, I look exactly at the expansion of the movement from a relatively small number of national groups, albeit ones spread across nations like Uganda and South Africa as far as the end of the 1990s. But then the movement's necessary expansion through especially Africa and Asia in the context of controversies coming to focus around international sports with these sort of global sporting bodies struggling against specific intersex athletes, especially in the case of the Olympic Games and other controversies which have more recently sort of provided a focal point for figures ranging from Donald Trump to J.K. Rowling to sort of hound and demonize Black and African women in the public sphere. So that's actually the focus point of the preface of the book. I look especially at the success which Donald Trump enjoyed around the controversy following on the Olympic victory of Imani Khalif and the invalidation by her Italian defeated competitor. So the point of hermaphrodite logic is, to put it simply, how both international communication and collaboration proved to be especially rapid and easy from the end of the 20th century, but equally how the prospects of full-blown internationalist politics seem to be unmistakably bleak across the same time frame. So these are the sort of two contradictory features of the intersex movement, which I think are something we have to sort of sit with and work our way out with as far as we are able. And especially something which has interested me is the kind of ongoing focus around international community meetings and gatherings from across national contexts that have been sort of both enabled and necessitated by the recent shift towards intersex advocacies, often fulsome support by larger LGBT NGOs such as the Astoria Foundation or the ILGA World Group. So this being one example of a meeting in 2019 where OII staged a major European meeting, which you can see a photograph from that. Okay. So then finally, oh yeah, the final point to make about the internationalism is that this sort of expansion both into larger NGOs, like I was just talking about, and indeed the foundation of the Organization of Intersex International was especially necessitated by this compromising stance that appeared after the US movement's leadership, and especially feminist allies, so-called, had sort of slipped by the 2000s into a stance of clinical reform, which they described as patient advocacy. So especially in Anglophone organization, I was going to say discourses, but more like strategic struggles, this notion of like patient advocacy became a leadership focus, but not an overall movement position across the 2000s. So this sort of resulted especially in this kind of impasse between Anglophone and Francophone advocacy. So this sort of required new, larger, often continental structures. So between all that, the final point I wanted to get us to is that hermaphrodite logic provides an entangled history. So having started in 96, I sort of moved back through this back and forth development that appeared between academic researchers, key among them Susanna Kessler and Anne Fausto Sterling, and the earliest intersex movement advocates. So as well as borrowing stylistic and organizational forms from feminist consciousness consciousness raising groups or LGBT sort of edgy rhetorical stylings and self-formation around abject terms, as well as pulling those stylistic rhetorical flourishes from the LGBT and feminist movement. There was also a development of sex as a process, as a theoretical concern, which developed very much in a back and forth between the intersex movement and queer theory and academic feminism. And when we turn to trans theories and histories, figures like Susan Stryker, David Valentine, and the aforementioned figures in Boston Menace, Boston Transsexual Menace, were all sort of prominently involved organizationally in supporting the intersex movement. So my focus is not just on setting out the last gasp of 20th century counterculture, but also sort of providing a new mythological accounting that sort of adds to the more sort of famous slumbering forms which appear on the front cover of the book. Those being the depictions of Polydectes, where we see a sleeping hermaphrodite either sleeping upon a fine mattress in the modern depiction, or sort of like goatskin shawl in the version you can find in Florence. So these sort of famous or notorious slumbering hermaphrodites have their counterpoint in the more dynamic figures of struggle, which you're seeing on the screen currently. These are known as the Dresden pattern of hermaphrodite depictions. And rather than showing like this sleeping figure who's sort of approached by the voyeuristic statue's observer, instead we see like a satyr having made a failed lunge towards a hermaphrodite who then pinions them by the throat or throws them to the ground with the clashing 8 limbs you can see distinctively known as symplegma or entanglement. So Hermaphrodite Logic is sort of an attempt to provide an entangled history, both in that I want to provide a full modern agonistic focus on the political struggle, the very brief political struggle, which is run from the 1990s up to the present, and doesn't allow that specific struggle in its objective historical dimensions to fade from view. But equally, I don't want to sort of like repress or hide away the hermaphroditic mythological notion of sexual indifference, which sexological clinical orthodoxies have sort of in various ways across different eras sort of taken different approaches towards, either terming hermaphroditism pseudo or then shifting into a viewpoint which solely sees it as a disorder or a chaotic form of indeterminacy. So in that sense, the book is both attempting to provide a clear and comprehensive through line of movement struggle, but also allowing for a slightly more varied and slightly more twisted and interlocking understanding of the intersex movement, along with the other various countercultural pushes, which sort of mutually enable one another by the end of the 20th century and up to the present. So that is as schematic and as sketchy as I can possibly get. But I hope at very least that's provided us with a couple of provocations or barbs for us to chew over as we continue.
Thank you so much, Jules. That was fantastic. I hope you just gave our listeners the final push to pre-order your book if they haven't done so already. All right, I think now we have about 30 minutes for some questions. I have a couple of questions. It would also be fun if you ask each other questions. But I'm just going to start things off, and then we can see what kind of topics we land on and what resonates most with both of you. So my first question I have for both of you is on the topic of liberatory, this is a difficult word, liberatory knowledge. Your books discuss the forms of knowledge that emerge from political movements themselves, in contrast and opposition to often the forms of knowledge that have emerged from within disciplines like queer theory and universities and other more formal or institutionalized settings. So your book, Jules, Hermaphrodite Logic, and I'm quoting from the book here, quote, provides a new history of the political movement that made intersex people widely understood as people at all. You write that now many have some vague sense that intersex people have been mistreated, and what your book does is point to the history of, quote, how this understanding was the consequence of a hard-won struggle. And the struggle over the common sense for epistemic justice in the medical domain and, of course, beyond is really central to the movements you're talking about. Could you tell us a bit more about what liberatory knowledge means to you?
I think you should take that, Jules.
Oh, sure. I think that um, I think that the point around liberatory knowledge, which I was trying to get into, is that there's both a twofold understanding that intersex advocates were obliged to make. And the first was sort of coming to grips with a rather complex set of health needs, which each of the participants in these movements experienced. But secondly, the previous efforts which had been done to sort of disrupt and scatter any collective awareness or any kind of collective consciousness which intersex people could come to. So using examples like some of the ones which I just showed you on screen, I tackle that in terms of a moment of self-consciousness. So specifically self-consciousness meaning that they sort of come to realize the ways that they had been witnessed or the ways that they've been processed, not only by medical professionals, but also figures from the state, members of their direct family, and so on. And the reason that this is such a big focus for the book is that these are both sort of very both things which consider to be transformed rapidly at the same time, and this appears this appears as soon as we have these protests, which I'm referring to, and one of the participants, Max Beck, in this protest back in '96, gives a speech which is sort of referring to how the typical fate of intersex people was being lost to feedback, and ends the speech with sort of saying, well, now we've come to we've come to offer you, we've come to offer a response to that. So so that's like that's what I'm trying to get at and trying to provide some way into through this book. So both like charting that process and also hopefully promoting its continuation.
Mm.
I had the privilege of starting to read Hermaphrodite Logic because I got an advanced copy. And I have a question, Jules, which is I saw that someone actually in the YouTube comments mentioned Rosemary Hennessy's book, Profit and Pleasure. And in that book, Rosemary Hennessy makes this distinction between two strands of queer theory. One strand is the avant-garde queer theory of Lee Edelman and Dinah Foos and others that developed in the early 90s, is informed by psychoanalysis and takes a sort of textual approach to identity as a kind of signification. And then Hennessy says there's a second strand of queer theory that is more materialist and is represented by people like Butler or David Halperin or Michael Warner. And they are seeking to bring into view the more social and political dimensions of sexuality rather than the sort of psychic ones. In Hermaphrodite Logic, you're actually less concerned with queer studies, and you actually make the case that intersex advocacy grew out of feminist theorists who are thinking of sex as process. I was just wondering if any of the researchers whose intellectual history you're tracing can be fit into either strand of queer theory, or maybe not at all.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Um, I think that I think that when we say sex as process, I guess to give people some idea of what we mean, mostly what we mean is they were providing uh either like anthropological kind of case studies in the case of Suzanne Tesla, or in Anne Foster Sterling's case, this sort of like tongue-in-cheek essay in the form of the essay on the five sexes. And the reason I highlight these two academic essays is these are actually scholars who were approached directly from some of the founding figures of the Intersex Society of North America. So they became sort of central to this back and forth between scholarly research of intersex people and the early organizing of intersex people themselves. The question of as to where exactly they would fit on this kind of like divide which Hennessy sets out is a very interesting one to me. I sort of can't really, yeah, I guess I can't really place them so comfortably like between these two figures, and I guess it's like materialist in the loosest sense insofar as it's looking at institutional and sort of discursive processing, which intersex people get put through. But I think, yeah, maybe these aren't really possible to place across that typical methodological divide within queer theory. And yeah, you're quite correct that the book doesn't really get into. There was originally going to be like more work in the book done around the specific failings of like the Foucauldian base level, like the ways that a lot of this critical intersex studies sort of operates. But I think I sort of like ditched that along the way because it's quite difficult to both sort of introduce and critique scholarly work simultaneously. So I think there's sort of like only so much multitasking that could really be fit into it. But yeah. I guess actually that also draws us back to knowledges, right?
Hmm. Another question I had was about a question of methods. So I wonder how your approach to your role as writers and researchers played out in terms of your methodological commitments to doing your work. What did that look like in practice? How did you go about planning your projects? How did you go about engaging with the politics of the archive? And what does it mean to do historical research in gender studies for you guys?
Uh, so I can writing queer history from below, we might say, comes with all the um, archival challenges of pretty much any historical project that studies subaltern um, histories, movements, lives. Uh, and many of the actors that I write about in my book certainly struggled with being heard in their own lifetime due to precarity or persecution or early death. And they often had only very tentative relationships to formal knowledge centers, if they had any at all. But what's interesting about writing about queer history is that the availability of textual material on gay life uh, that comes out of an emphasis on coming out and sharing one's story that you find within movement histories. So in the 1960s, collective gay consciousness went hand in hand with the proliferation of new memoirs and documentaries and uh, open letters and autobiographical writings within the gay and lesbian community. And then in the decade after, for the Black lesbian feminists, um, poetry was actually a much more central literary form. So I look more at poetry than it's only really in the following decade of the 1980s when queer theory is established and institutionalized as an academic discipline that you get that more pronounced split between texts that are produced by academics, often at quite elite universities, and then activists within the community. The biggest challenge that I had when I was writing the book was that the available material was overwhelmingly US based. So I was trying to provide an account of the transnational links that US activists were making with struggles abroad, but then the Americanist character of my sources meant that the book is mostly an account of how those transnational links were perceived domestically. So it's a study of how US-based groups perceived struggles abroad and identified with struggles abroad, um, and oriented themselves towards non-US sites, but the voices of their interlocutors who they often met on their travels are easily lost. And that's because of the limitations of the archive. So the book ends up being less attentive to how foreign radicals and foreign revolutionaries received the US radicals or responded to them or also challenged them. So that means that even as I'm trying to uncover a transnational encounter between movements, those encounters often remain somewhat one-sided because the US-based sources are so overrepresented in the archive.
Yeah, I think in our preliminary discussions preparing for this talk, I shared this frustration with Alex that you have this in the same way that EROS and Empire sort of struggles with this um, what we could call like US centrism by volume, right? Like there's just so much more material about Americans, even if it's not by them. But in the same way, I feel like the history of intersex is too often something that reduces to the history of sexologists. Gritchy Mack has this term, yeah, like the history of clinical concepts, that is one of her key frustrations with um, another one of the figures discussed at length in the book, Alice Trieger. So the issue with reducing to clinical concepts as a way of understanding intersex or any other um, minoritized position is it often results in relatively conservative and especially relatively established figures in sexology who are just extensively self-documenting and provided us with reams and reams of insider information on the working of their practices and of their thinking. So what the risk becomes all too quickly is that people sort of satisfy themselves a bit too quickly in my view. So people put out a kind of critical discursive reading about how these sexologists, what they thought they were up to, and maybe some sort of fleeting coverage of the injury they did to people as it appears in that same archive. But this is often something which I feel like satisfies researchers in the humanities all too often. Like it's kind of considered to be a done deal once they've provided a critical discursive overview of things. And maybe then a methodological genuflection towards relying on this contaminated archive, which sort of just fills up more pages. So that's something which I wanted to do very differently with Hermaphrodite Logic, and one thing which I was quite pleased to see Alex also sort of attempting and achieving with Eros and Empire. So that's something I think like the two books very much have in common. And yeah, something which has been interesting me a great deal lately. Like, what other ways can we like satisfy ourselves, and what kind of acceptable what acceptable points to stop our research can we sort of rework beyond sort of like just kind of discursive categorization and puncturing and exposure.
That was really interesting. Thank you. So let's talk about desire and historical materialism. Both of your books feature some accounts of desire, feature some accounts of the gay movement's erotic world making or the intersex advocates' call for a hermaphroditic eros. So what can Marxist theory provide us here? What's the historical materialism in both of your books?
I'm so excited to hear your your answer on this, Jules. I mean, I feel like I it's funny because I have a chapter in my book called A Marxist Theory of Desire, and then I go on to be like, we can't have a Marxist theory of desire. I certainly don't provide one. I think I'm when it comes to thinking about eros and desire, I'm quite skeptical of the notion that we can derive sort of all the dimensions of human desire from an analysis of the laws of capital or the mode of production or anything like that. Like the form of desire, the content of desires, what desires can be revolutionary, counter-revolutionary. I don't think those are questions that can be answered at a high level of abstraction, but that's okay. I don't think that means Marxism has nothing to say about desire, that we can't have a Marxist approach to the study of desire. So in my book, I kind of what I do is I argue that the term queer or maybe now today it would be the term gender, has been used to designate human desires that are seen as threatening to the reproduction of um, bourgeois civil society, or we might call it capitalist civil society. And that's why we get all these associations of queerness with things like pornography, pedophilia, prostitution, drugs, madness, disease, anything that is seen as improper in some way. But those associations are historically very variable. So we need a more concrete analysis of a particular conjuncture if we want to be able to say something substantive about the relationship between desire and capital at any given moment. That the point really is quite simple, which is that history happens, and over the course of capitalism's history, we see capital continually undermine the relations of gender, sexuality, desire, the family, which at one point may have facilitated its accumulation and then orchestrate new ones. Because capitalism is a system of expansion that is constantly coming up against limits that it sets itself and then denaturalizing them and then renaturalizing them. So what that means is that what might count as a queer desire one day can't be assumed to be eternally antagonistic to capitalism. They, I think queer desires within a particular moment can expose and politicize certain exclusions or open up horizons for social change, but they're not a reliable guide to political action precisely because capitalism is a system that's constantly denaturalizing a lot of the relations of desire that might sustain it at one point. So in the context, if to be a bit more concrete, if we took the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that was a decade when neoconservatives in the United States were basically saying that the mass death of queer people was a righteous punishment that would teach them to abandon their deviant sexual practices. And at that moment, a defense of queer sex was absolutely a radical act that could name an antagonism to sort of neoliberal forces of gentrification and privatization. But then if you move forward 20 years, a lot of those non-normative kinds of sex had become more mainstream, then it's not really clear anymore that that would necessarily be the case, that a defense of queer sex would be radical. I think a lot of the anti-gender movement and a lot of the transphobes seem also, for example, less concerned with how people are having sex and more with gender identifications and so on. Whereas in the 90s, the backlash was mostly about how people were having sex. So I think desire, and especially non-normative desire, can animate anti-capitalist politics, perhaps, but desire and politics don't coincide neatly. So we need a more historicized understanding of both queerness and desire, is what I kind of end up saying in the book, because otherwise we end up with quite romantic and naive ideas about the inherent radicality of certain types of sexual identities or sexual practices.
There's a pair of really excellent questions for me in the chat, but I am going to return to those later from Colin and Max, because I am happy to be having this discussion with you, Alex. And for the viewers at home who don't know either of us, we've been part of this historical materialism conference for, I think, more than a decade now, right? I think I first was going along in 2013. So these are conversations which have been going on for a very long time between us and those in our circles. And from what you just said, I think the most true part is you say that there's like a chapter on desire in the book, and you're not comfortable that you really even attempt it by the end of it. And it's very real, right? It's like this stuff is a lot easier said than done. And I wrote myself this question in my notes, which is just like the modes of production always have to operate above the belt. That's what I wrote. And then I realized that this is a very spicy question, especially as a question I have no idea what the answer to that is, because I think I know what the problem is, which is that yeah, modes of production have to be above the belt. Like people want to think about hunger and people needing to feed themselves and clothe themselves and protect themselves from the elements. And we could like expand sexuality, desire, dysphoria, into what I call craving. In the beginning of the introduction to transgender Marxism, I talk about the need to sort of expand out materialism, like expand materialism, like from the belly to the rest of the belly. You know what I mean? To these inner secretions, to hormones, to stuff like that. And that is something which is very easy to like line up suggestively and say that we've got to do it. But then it often seems quite difficult to actually follow through and achieve that. Um, so yeah, I think maybe the cop out is I don't think like really hermaphrodite logic is an attempt to do that. I do try and introduce what I call like the expressiveness of sex. But I think it's quite hard to provide a thoroughgoing materialist account of homosexual desire or bisexuality or any I guess like hormonal craving or dysphoric breakdowns or anything like that, right? These seem like they're very difficult tasks to do. The final thing I want to pick up though is the hermaphroditic eros, right? So this is actually a quote from a VHS tape, very 90s. There's this VHS tape called Hermaphrodites Speak that is from a few months before the protest I started my presentation with. And there's this New Zealand activist who talks about what they see as like the need to like come to grips with that and the key thing about intersex experience. And I think I flagged that up in the book, especially because it's something that I don't really feel like the intersex movement consistently tries to develop or sort of tease out. And I'm curious about what would happen if we sort of yeah, I'm curious about how we can sort of get back to those concerns and this sort of like symplegma entangled statue, this satyr getting slapped down from this newborn nymphy hermaphrodite at the end. Maybe that's one like way into it, but I think that that's what I have an interest in doing. But maybe I don't really know I know the destination, but not the map or even the contours we're dealing with yet.
Brilliant. Jules, did you want to answer the questions from
I
the
think actually I want to give Alex a chance to respond because I was just talking for like 5 minutes straight. So
No, I have nothing to add. I'm very keen to hear your responses to Colin and Max. Should we read them out, maybe?
Okay, so Max Thornton asks to Jules, thank you for this fantastic talk. I am familiar with the theoretical connections between intersex and disability. Did you find any activist overlap between these movements? Also, Jules, another question I had, what is your beef with the word activist? You briefly mentioned that in your book.
oh, uh, just self-loathing squeamishness, really. There is a marvelous interview with one of these, fair weather allies. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there's an interview with a clinical professional who's like, oh, the intersex advocates who are reasonable, those I like to call advocates. But the people who are just like wanting to ban every single surgery and the people who are saying that we're doing human rights violation, I call those people activists. And I love these I love these moments where someone just gives the game away about the clinical legitimation of acceptable limits for self-advocacy, right? So it's a great quote that's in the book, and I think it's very fun. So I use the word advocate throughout as a kind of maybe a tongue-in-cheek allusion to this, but I don't think there's really a difference. Yeah. So concerning disability, so basically, Beau Laurent, better known as Cheryl Chase, which is that movement name. Beau Laurent names themselves after a 19th century blind advocate, Saint Laurent. So Saint Laurent was this figure who was known as the prophet of the blind. Beau Laurent is heavily informed by the very earliest disability activism down to their choice of the name. So there's that in the founder of ISNA. Similarly, Emma Kiyama, who's another figure most famous for writing the Trans Feminist Manifesto, features heavily in the book as another figure within ISNA who's sort of into patient advocacy and stuff around that. And similarly, the whole idea of people being referred to as people with intersex variations, which develops in the 2000s. This is pulled straight from one position of disability advocacy in the United States, especially. And this becomes sort of tied up with the sort of US centric Anglophone approaches that I was referring to in the beginning. But I don't think that so the ties are dense and long-standing, it's fair to say. So there's a lot of deep connections. The one theoretical point which I'm wondering about more and more is whether we can even see intersex variations as impairments in the majority of cases. And if people want to read the book, then this is the point which a bunch of different figures, including Ian Morland and Morgan Holmes, who appeared at the start of my presentation, protesting alongside Max Beck. These are a bunch of very long-standing theoretical questions which intersex thinkers have been trying to tackle. So if people are curious about that, not all of this is actually in the book, but there's a lot of entry points into these long-running discussions in critical intersex studies in that. So that's the best thing I can advise. So short answer, yes, heavy, extensive, deep, even nominal overlaps. Okay, and how far have intersex advocates changed clinical practices, e.g. on newborns? Not enough yet, but definitely I think they've undermined the justifications of abusive surgeries. A thing I would say is also there's this sort of shuffle which occurs with basically clinical attempts to keep this stuff from being outlawed. Often it sort of takes the following approach, which is they simply like try and isolate a single variation. Most recently, it's mostly congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So they attempt to like isolate a single variation, and they're like, well, this doesn't qualify as being intersex, or this doesn't qualify even as being a disorder of sex development, a DSD, and therefore any legislation which is brought in does not cover the surgeries which we really want to do. So this is like an ongoing thing which Elizabeth Rice, Reis, Elizabeth Rice's book, I think, is the best one, other than mine, which is sort of exploring that sort of like 1-2 step, which medical professionals and sadly increasingly advocates of family rights, both in the US and in Germany. So yeah, so there are moves which are taken to attempt to keep these surgeries legal. Although one thing I should also note is one of the things which is keeping these surgeries legal increasingly is actually legislation introduced to outlaw transition for children and teenagers. Because usually these bits of legislation will explicitly include clauses which exempt intersex variations from legal protection. So if you read any of these model bills from the red states, if you read the text of the federal ban on transition, which passed recently in Russia, you will see the same thing, which is there's always an exemption, a formal legalization of surgery and other interventions on people with intersex variations, which those laws introduce. So this seems to kind of demonstrate to me and hopefully to everyone the sort of ways that the shaping of sex sort of gets set in place by reactionary regimes.
Brilliant. We have a couple minutes left, which is good because I have one final question, and then I'll leave it up to you to decide if you want to wrap it up there. So my final question is about strategy. I think both of your books are quite excellent in outlining successful strategic avenues of the movements that you examine. So I want to ask, in the current terrain of struggle, how might your interventions help us navigate the consolidation of far-right power in mainstream politics? What lessons for present movements can we glean from the work that you have done?
So there are so many parallels between the conditions that the movements that I write about in the book, that those movements are facing, and then current developments in our own context today. And I think organizers are already building on those political traditions in all sorts of ways. And so often in really direct ways. So I've seen queer and trans activist groups, for example, repurpose the silence equals death slogan that Jules had up on the presentation in their protests against the genocide in Gaza. So there are sort of clear examples of this, but of course, I think what lessons movements today take from those past movements will depend on considerations that are unique to their own context. What I think what's important is that when we're thinking about the consolidation of the far right and how to confront it today, we need I think we need to have an answer to widespread anxieties over the breakdown of traditional modes of reproduction. Because the far right is currently interpreting that reproductive crisis as a threat to survival of the white patriarchal nation. And so we're seeing a rapid renaturalization of white supremacy and patriarchal ideals and race science and eugenics and all that stuff is back. But what we see here, I think, is figures on the far right colonizing in bad faith issues that should be part of a left-wing program. So these are things like critiques of the pharmaceutical industry or issues to do with health and nutrition and feelings of loneliness and alienation within the public. All of those issues that the far right is speaking to are issues of human needs and wants and desires for things like health and well-being and intimacy and connection. And those are exactly the areas of life that the activists we've been speaking about, the gay liberationists and the black feminists and the AIDS activists and the intersex liberationists, they were all doing the same thing, but they were envisioning emancipated futures for those areas of our lives. And one thing that I hope my book shows clearly is that in the past, the left way too often made the mistake of treating those aspects of our lives as secondary or actually as bourgeois deviations. And the left would do so again at its own peril. It would be a huge mistake. What we need is a vision of self-determination and human flourishing and fulfillment. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I think the trans feminist movement is arguably offering us some of the most revolutionary um, visions here. But I'll end on this because this is an HM thing, which is that movement has to be anti-capitalist. I think one of the things that is actually that the trans feminist movement reminds us of is the very simple point that capitalism is not a system that works to fulfill human needs. It's a system that works to produce value. And that couldn't be more clear today within the context of the reproductive crisis that many societies are facing. So we know that um, certainly in post-industrial states like the US and the UK, the demand for care is increasing, but there's been a systematic failure to sustain reproductive infrastructures and labor at the levels that can meet the needs of many people, especially the elderly and people with disabilities and children. And the source of that care crisis is capital's own devaluation of unproductive activities or low productivity activities, which would include, of course, the care work that makes up a large proportion of the service sector, the growing service sector. And so you have the far right, which is claiming that trans people and their woke allies are threatening the white nation. But what is actually happening is that we live under a capitalist system that subordinates unproductive to productive activity at all costs, even if that means expanding surplus populations, leaving entire surplus populations to die. So we need a critique of capitalism. We need a critique of the ways that it devalues reproductive work and leaves so many without adequate provision of care. Otherwise, we'll end up blaming the crisis on the most vulnerable communities. And we'll end up investing capitalist states with greater powers to wield against those communities, which is the current program of our current ruling elites. And I think an answer to that is found in the trans feminist movement.
Yeah, that's a really brilliant exposition of where we're at currently. And as I already said, like in the first 5 pages of this book, like in the preface of the book, I get into this point where people are often wanting to see these, they often don't understand the intersex liberation in its own terms, so they want to sort of dismiss these things as niche or marginal or identity driven and all of that. But the kind of people who don't see this as so marginal, the people who see it as central are figures like Donald Trump, who won every swing state after a needlessly hostile campaign about the Olympics and a North African boxer's participation in it. You know what I mean? Like this is the figures who see these concerns as central are the figures who are winning right now. So that's enough hyping up of my own book. I think in Eros of Empire, something that Alex hasn't maybe gotten into so much in this discussion is also Eros and Empire has this really brilliant critical examination of the failings of even sort of anti-assimilation gay self-advocacy. And you've got a whole chapter where you sort of challenge this idea that there's like the radical anti-assimilation queers who are smart and have good politics, and then the sort of like conciliatory sort of bougie queers or whatever, and you're sort of looking at that from an anti-imperialist point of view and sort of getting into that. So I think like we both need to try and understand our movements like in their own terms and understand the terms that they were using in their intellectual histories. But we also need to be like incisive and critical and anti-imperialist in our understanding of um, our own movements and our own comrades in the organizations we've been part of. So I hope that I'm one part of that, and I know that Alex's work is definitely um, contributing to that ongoing process. So once again, it's been really sweet participating in this after all these years, and I'm looking forward to many more discussions like this as our struggles continue around the world.
On that question, I copied a sentence from your book, Jules, that I really liked. So in the context of the climate crisis and in the gay frogs panic, you write the following sentence, which I think is a beautiful end to the session today. You write, "The intersex movement should be clear. Even those of us declared freakish, unnatural, or the offspring of toxic waste share the same natural order as those who condemn us. Frogs, newts, humans, and alligators all deserve a habitable planet, whatever their sex is."
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentations and answers and questions to each other. Thank you for coming to our listeners, and let's wrap it up here. Yeah?
Thank you both so much.
Ciao, ciao.
All right. Have a wonderful evening and speak soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Oh, Jules left.